We have a great deal to get through here in the next couple of days, and one of the things we're trying to do today is sort of get a grasp on a world that seems very much like it's ready to tilt out of control, and bad things can happen in a flash. Every time we look at some event in the world, including this morning's fatal crash out of Iran, we worry about the incident itself, and then we worry about this tinderbox that the world exists in, and what the flow-on effects are of these matters. So I have to ask you, because you are joining us from an important part of the world right now, which is central to so many tensions. These tensions involve certain tensions that are coming from North Korea and China's role in that, obviously Russia's role with respect to Ukraine, and the fears of what happens to NATO after this U.S. election in November. And then there is this constant question of China, an expansionist China, a China that is making deals with and continuing having conversations with the rest of the world. And in your part of the world, places like the Philippines and South Korea and Japan that are seeing increased militarization, possibly as a response to that. And you're in the middle of all of this. You're in the middle of this very complicated world. We haven't even touched India yet. How are you looking at the world, its stability, and your role in it?
How long do we have? Okay. The big question for everyone now is really US-China and how each region, countries within each region, deal with that issue. And Southeast Asia, if you look at it, is, as you say, pretty much the epicenter of it. Because if you look at China, it's a geographical fact. It's contiguous with Southeast Asia. And it's got every country in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, the biggest trading partner is China. On the other hand, US has been a clear security presence, economic presence, pretty much since the Second World War. Korea, Vietnam, subsequently. And most of us prospered, grew rich by trading in a rules-based order that the US set up and basically led. And today you have a situation where there are a number of flashpoints. You have Taiwan, obviously, potential flashpoint between US and China. You have Philippines, which is a US security partner, ally. You have Japan, which has a border dispute with China, dispute over some islands, and is an ally of the US. So in the context of these issues, we look at it, first, the way the US is approaching China. It's got three options. One, insist on being number one. The other, accept China as eventually becoming number one, or possibility. Or third, find some arrangement. Today, I think the bipartisan mood in the US is pretty much a very quite anti-China. And if you look at the small yard, high fence strategy, we in Southeast Asia look at it, the supply chains are all integrated. Some of them are in China, some of them are in Southeast Asia. Quite a lot is in Southeast Asia, elsewhere. So how do you disintegrate that? How do you work that around? What impact is that going to have on us? And is it even possible, like you take dual-use chips, if you prevent, first of all, can you prevent China from getting them in this sort of world where they're available everywhere else? How do you enforce those rules? And can it really be a small yard? Because your enforcement might have to be broader and broader and broader. And what does that do to the supply chains? What does that do to our economies? Second, even if you succeeded in doing it, can the Chinese be prevented from making it themselves? How long can you prevent them? Even high-end chips. That's one question. Second, you look at trade between US and China, $690 billion a year before, come down to under 600 now, billion. But then that doesn't take into account trade from China that has moved to other countries and then goes into the US. So how successful can you be in decoupling? So these are big questions. And from a Chinese perspective, you know, the famous saying, under Chairman Mao, China stood up after more than 100 years of humiliation as they see it. Under Deng Xiaoping, they started becoming rich. And now under the current president, it's their turn to become strong. 1.3 billion people, very smart, very active, very hardworking, with the ability to access science, technology, physics, maths, and have been a great civilization. So can they really be prevented from achieving what they want to achieve? And can there be a modus vivendi between the US and China? It's a big question for us with very serious security and economic consequences. Each of us is thinking about it because none of us wants to choose.
Yeah.
It's really not a choice for us because we need both. Both are indispensable for us. I would say the tensions also have been, are reflected in the fact that you see a great impetus for the security arrangements between US and its allies, Korea, South Korea, as well as Japan. You see AUKUS. None of this is said to be targeted at China. In fact, they expressly say it's not targeted at China. But if you are Chinese, you could be forgiven for thinking that you are in some way the reason for all of these moves taking place. In this context, there was a survey recently in Southeast Asia about how people view US and China. So rather than me saying it, I can look at the survey, which is more representative. For the first time ever...
These are people in Southeast Asia.
People in Southeast Asia, how they view US, how they view China. I mean, the questions are a little precise, but let me just, give you some broad sense. I would say for the first time ever, China ranked slightly above the US, but it's pretty much a wash. It's like 50.5% versus 49 point something.
And this is generally like polling where we do an approval level.
Yes, something like that.
Some sort of an approval
What
rate.
do you think of China? That sort of thing. But again, the picture is mixed because when you go to a second question, how much do you trust each of these countries? By the way, both were not highly trusted, but there were concerns about the economic influence of both countries, but at differing levels. In fact, because China does more, I think there was more concern about China's economic impact. So how you interpret it is a question of trying to make sense of it. But I would say it shows that over time, China's economic weight and economic influence and interactions, people recognize, and its weight is growing.
And this is inevitable. It was inevitable. It's inevitable that the similar things are going to happen in India, which is in the midst of an election right now. So you don't think of these growing tensions between global powers as existential for you. You're thinking about it as what's our best bet from in terms of security relationships and trade relationships, and you'd like to have both with both.
Well, it could become existential if it becomes a kinetic situation. But subject to that, both are essential from our perspective. And therefore, we would say, and we don't, I think you can't make a clear distinction between security relationship, economic relationship, but you would say both need to be around and we need to do business with both. We need to deal with both. And for that, we'll have to, in a way, hope that both can find a new arrangement.
And what does that look like? Because right now, and look, there are clearly efforts, perhaps in the wake of Russia-Ukraine, for China not to get into things that look like direct confrontations with the United States, particularly over Taiwan. But there are also overtures by the Chinese who've been making their way through Europe all the way to France to sort of say, in a post-Joe Biden, possible Donald Trump world where NATO is a weaker military alliance potentially, is China trying to have a bigger role on that front? So it's not just a Belt Road Initiative, it's not just trade relationships where they go, but to say that we might even have a security presence and a security relationship in a way that we haven't had in the post-war era.
If you are the second largest economy in the world, which China is, and you look at the three largest economic centers, one is North America, one is Europe, in fact Europe is number 2, and China, these three. If you were China, it makes eminent sense if the US is constantly painting you as the enemy, number 1, to have a closer relationship, security, economic, with Europe. Anyway, Europe is economically important for China, and vice versa. And prior to the Ukraine war, in fact, you could see that Europe, partly because of the presidency under Mr. Trump, and partly for economic reasons, you could say Europe was, while not equidistant, was closer to China than it was before, right? And some people were talking about Europe drifting away and taking a middle path and so on. I'm not sure how realistic that was given the NATO guarantees. But after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think that has made Europe probably realize that in the end the US is indispensable.
Yes.
And if anything brought US and Europe much closer together, I don't know what another Trump presidency would do to that, but Mr. Trump seems to recognize that Europe is important for NATO from some of his statements. Every time you write off the US, I remember an old statement from a statesman from a previous era, I think Metternich or someone, that there is a strange providence which looks after drunkards, orphans, and the United States of America. So never write the US off.
Let's talk about, because it's important and you are in the region, India is in the midst of a very, very important election. We seem to think that Narendra Modi is going to prevail yet again. But there have been concerns about India drifting in a direction that feels like a lot of other countries are drifting in, feeling a little bit more autocratic than democratic, curtailing freedom of the press, and doing things that are a little bit worrisome to the West. Obviously, India is a growing and important member in your region. What's your sense of it?
The sense of what you describe as autocratic and freedom of the press? Well, my view of these things is, look, I wish people would talk a little bit more about governance and what it means for people on the ground.
Yeah.
And a little bit less on some of these forms. Anyone who has been in India and who is switched on to all the different channels, I think can be forgiven for thinking that perhaps there is a surfeit of news channels and a multiplicity of viewpoints. If you look at the last 10 years, and I'm not, my primary interests are that of a Singaporean and Singapore's national interest, so let me be clear about that. But I'm simply an observer here. If you look at the last 10 years, by common consent, several hundred million people have been lifted out of poverty. I don't see the international media talking about that much. I see them talking about if A is arrested or B is arrested or C is arrested. I don't see the international media talking about the huge amount of corruption that has been going on before, or whether it has come down or gone up or has remained the same. To me, what matters is how many people are now better off? What are people's lives really like on the ground? What is women empowerment like? What about education for the people in the rural and urban centers like? Not if you're well connected and wealthy, but ordinary people. What are their lives like? And what are they saying? And can anyone really believe that this country, I forget how many states there are, but it's got multiplicity of languages. Some guy in the north speaks Hindi, some guy in the south speaks a completely different language. The script is different, the language is different. It's many different countries, like the Balkans, put together. At least in the Balkans, they all look a little bit alike. Here, they look different too. And I've often wondered, how is India even governable? How does one man or one party or somebody sitting in the center try and put across rules that can apply to this large 1.3 billion people across north to south in a fairly large country? So in that context, I think most people, if you look at governance, would say India has been growing slowly over the years. They used to call it somewhat derisively as a Hindu rate of growth. I think you can say that growth has increased more substantially. I think you can say that a lot of people have been lifted out of poverty. Does that mean that you have to agree with everything that this government or the previous governments have done? No. But I would say when you characterize the positives and negatives, it's far better to look at whether growth is real, whether improvement in lives is real, whether the corruption is more or less, without myself passing a comment, rather than take a very, I'm sorry to say this, but it's almost a lazy way of looking at it, not you, but often the Western media I read about many Asian countries, including Singapore. It's a headline, oh, freedom of the press is affected, or people are affected. This is autocratic. What does autocratic mean when you have a government that is going for elections across all these states and where the people have the ability to vote the government out? How is that autocratic? It may not be a Western liberal democracy, but that doesn't automatically equal to autocratic.
I think that's an important and distinct point, that there's a spectrum, and it becomes easy for us to find points on that spectrum and determine that some things are autocratic and some things are dictatorial. I grant you your point, and that we are sometimes less nuanced than we should be on that issue.
Can I interrupt and make one more point?
Yeah.
The Americans had this summit of democracies.
Yeah.
In the summit of democracies, they invited various countries,
Yeah.
including a number of countries from around the world, Democratic Republic of Congo, Pakistan. All of those are great democracies. I have no issues. They didn't think Singapore was a democracy. Mm-hmm. They didn't think Sri Lanka was a democracy. They didn't think that Turkey was a democracy. So, I would be careful about this democracy versus autocracy kind of.
So let's just go narrower. Is there a world in which you see, because we see it in the United States very clearly, that greater exercise of accountability on the part of the press is important to good governance? So let's put aside whether we're talking about democracy or autocracy or dictatorships or forms of government. It does seem to be that the press is under attack around the world in every one of these instances that we're looking at. Is there a way in which we can nurture greater freedoms of the press and then perhaps separate them from some of these conversations about the form of government? Because there can be very good governments in places that do not enjoy full democracy, and yet there is the ability for the press to bear witness to what's going on and hold authority to account.
Yeah. I think, there is an important role that the media has to play. And in every country, my own view is that the media has the role to play both in projecting the country's interests and informing the citizens, telling the citizens what's happening, and informing accurately if what the government is doing, including if the government is going wrong.
Right.
I think there is a role for that. There are two questions. One is, every institution in many of these countries is subject to some oversight. Who has oversight over the media? And second, if the media can effectively be owned by a single media mogul, where does accountability come from?
In some cases, those media moguls are tied to the government. That's where it becomes
Or
tricky
opposite.
for us. Yes.
And the second point I would make is the role of the media must be to inform, to be a watchdog, to be clear, but not to campaign for or against policies. No one has elected the media to campaign. If they inform and they educate and they identify wrongdoing, that's fine. But if they start campaigning, then I think they are crossing the line. That's our view anyway. Yeah.
Where do you see, let's go right back to the elephant in the room, the United States right now. This is a country that has what some people think is an existential election coming up in November. You have stated as a small country that you would like to maintain strong relations with the United States, including security relations, strong trading relationships with the United States and with China. China is a bigger trading partner for you than the United States is at the moment. Are you concerned, and do you think Americans or the world should be concerned about the existential political situation that some describe the United States as facing?
I don't believe the U.S. is facing any existential crisis. It goes up and down. What I do think is that the U.S. has tremendous strengths, and by God, they are really testing those strengths with the system they have. And one might even say the very deep polarization and divisions, Congress, within Congress. The latest I see, it's quite unedifying. It wasn't very long ago when I used to think, oh, the US Congress, everyone is so polite to each other. And that's a model. And within my own lifetime, I see people talking about each other's eyelashes and so on.
And that was just yesterday.
So, debate has come down, you could say, a notch. And, but the US has a great strength as attracting the best talent from all over the world, and still very much in the lead in specific areas and sectors in terms of innovation, science, technology. Never write off the US, but it could be doing much better than it is. And I worry about various other aspects, the security situation within the US, the drug situation, the arms, and so on. And I think also the US leadership in the world, for the reasons we touched on but didn't go into detail, is now in some question because of how the US is seen as responding to different situations. In some cases invoking international law, in some cases seem to be acting not quite consistent with international law. And therefore the US leadership, which the global South had in the past accepted, now is very much a question mark. So both internally, domestically, and externally, I think the US is facing significant challenges, but I wouldn't quite put it as existential.
Well, you make me feel better. I'll take that. Minister, thank you for your comments and your observations from your perspective. It's important for us to have at a conference like this, where we're a global conference, to have the perspective of somebody from Southeast Asia who can give us some sense of how it looks from right in the middle of the storm. So we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, everybody. A great conversation.